Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur here, and today we are continuing in our look at the Bolt Action Alliance 2020 pack, looking at the scenario simply called Nuts. I have so many questions about where the name comes from, what the background is behind it, but just suffice it to say, it's an interesting scenario because it has one way to score, but it kind of has two, and it all depends. And it's designed mostly to solve one of the more common problems that you tend to have when it comes to objective style missions. But more on that in a little bit. Suffice it to say, we're going to be continuing to do what we normally do by looking at, so how does the scenario play? What are the victory conditions? Which units are more likely or less likely to struggle on it? We'll talk a little bit about deployment and terrain considerations. And then one tiny change that I would recommend, which might make it a little more interesting and a little more on par for what I think the theme is supposed to be. So to start off with, in terms of what victory conditions look like, first of all, you can infiltrate in this one and you can outflank. As far as I can tell, there's no restrictions. This does make it very interesting. More on that in a little bit. Okay. But suffice it to say, you're working with, for deployment, what we'll call the prepared position style of deployment, right? So in this case, you have a long table edge, but it's not up to 12 inches. It's within 6 inches of the edge. So you have a 36-inch no man's land in between instead of the typical 24. This is important. Okay. And the reason why is because you're going to have 5 objectives. You're going to have one in the center, and then players alternate placing an objective in each of the 4 quarters. So if you imagine that you draw a halfway line down the long edges and a halfway line down the short edges, and then connect from there, you've got your 4 quarters, similar to quarters deployment like you have in sectors and other scenarios like that we've talked about. In this case, each of those 4 quarters is going to have one objective. And there are 3 requirements for those objectives. First of all, they cannot be within 6 inches of a board edge. Fair enough. They cannot be within 12 inches of each other. Makes sense. That's also pretty standard. And they cannot be within 18 inches of the center. Now, in most of these scenarios, they would have to not be within 12 inches of the center. This one expands the radius to reflect the fact that the deployment zones are smaller. This does a lot to make sure that it is a little bit harder for units to just hippity hop from one objective to the next. You are actually going to have to take a turn or two to maneuver from one objective to the other in a lot of cases. Okay. But there's no requirement that it has to be a certain number of inches away from a quarter from the other quarter. So quick note, like you could have potentially one of these 4 zone objectives almost on a line if you really wanted to, depending on where the other ones have been placed already. They just got to be within, beyond 12 inches of each other. So, and beyond 6 inches of the table edge and beyond 18 inches of the center. But you can see that there is a possibility from placement that you could have one pretty close to the center line if you really wanted to. Okay. Now the defender chooses their side after all of this is done, and then they deploy up to half of their forces. The rest are going to be left in reserve. And then the attacker does the same, and the rest of their forces are also left in reserve. There are 2 important things to note about this. First of all, if you're one of those nations who gets a benefit for calling people in from reserve, either avoiding the outflanking penalty or avoiding the standard reserves penalty in various ways, whether that's, guys signaling in for guys from the rear to come on in, or whether that's, just the American in general, ignoring the -1 penalty for reserve, or various, especially minor nations who tend to get to avoid the -1 penalty for outflanking. Some units specific to other nations also get this benefit. All of those are going to be helpful because at least half of your units are going to be in reserve. Okay, so there's that. The second thing to note is that this is not alternating deployment. The defender gets the benefit of choosing their table side. And then, and I think this is actually really good game design, they then have to deploy all of their forces within that first half of their unit count. And then as a reaction to that, the attacker, who has been given their side, which might have less effective terrain, it might not be quite as efficient for them, the attacker has to then gets to deploy their half of their forces, but they already know where the enemy is. Okay? That, I think, is very interesting. As far as I know, that's not generally how most scenarios are done, but I think it works here. I think it gives a really good advantage, balance, so to speak, between the 2 armies. It's not like one person can look at the table, see that one side is better, take it, and then potentially also get advantageous deployments. So good on the designers. That's a very nice touch. I actually really like that. And then, of course, we're looking for objective control. So, infantry and artillery within 3 inches, no enemy infantry or artillery within 3 inches. Note that once again, and I think this is relatively common in the Bolt Action Alliance pack, there's no mentioning of vehicles being able to contest. So just keep that in mind. As far as I can tell on this one, vehicles cannot contest again. And then at the end of the game, the player with the most objectives wins. Okay. But in the event that you have 4 objectives that are controlled and 1 is not controlled, right? So, or I guess nobody has any objectives, I suppose, is another way of looking at it. Then something funky happens. If there's a tie, either at 0-0 or at 2-2 or 1-1 or whatever, instead of it just being called a draw like you would normally see in these scenarios, instead the scoring switches from looking at objective control to removal. It says that it scores like the no man's land scenario in the Bolt Action 2nd edition rulebook, which is just simply 1 victory point per unit that you've removed of the enemy. So it's possible, depending on how the game plays and whether, maybe there's a rule that is not specified in the scenario, but maybe it's the way that your group or your specific tournament plays, or if you want to maintain an objective, you have to stay on it. So, you can't just stick some guys on it, claim it, and then keep moving on. You got to routinely keep people on it. Well, that would mean that if your opponent takes some long gun shots way down range and they can remove the last unit that's holding one of your back objectives, that objective might go neutral because you aren't continuing to claim it. And they might not have enough time left in the game to go back and go get it. And I think that would be the most common scenario where you would see a tie on objectives. Okay. But if that were to happen, then at the end of the game, then the player with the most objectives wins, or the person with the most units removed wins. Okay. This means that you're rewarded for objective clearing, which makes sense with anything. And that's where tanks are going to be very effective. You're also rewarded for objective holding, which tanks are not going to be effective with. So you do need to have decent infantry. And all the while, you are trying to remove as many enemy units as possible, because if something should go crazy and you end up in a tie, you don't want to be behind on the number of units removed. So there's a lot of stuff going on in your head as you're playing this, right? You're playing to the objective and the literal 5 objectives, but there's also kind of this niggling secondary thing that you need to be thinking about that might become the prominent thing. And there's no way to know until the last order dice of the last turn is resolved in some cases. Obviously, sometimes it might be a more foregone conclusion before that. And then looking at the high performance units, we can see here that once again, I reproduced the objective stuff over there on the right-hand side just to confirm this. As you'll notice there, vehicles are not mentioned when it comes to scoring or preventing scoring. Okay. So toward that end, veteran squads are going to be really nice because they're going to be able to hold objectives, which you absolutely need to be able to do. They'll help you with taking objectives. They will be a little more reliable when they're on them, which is always nice. Transports are nice in that they help to get your men up, hopefully safely without you losing as many losses, because foot slogging, especially in 3rd edition, can be very, very dangerous. Okay. Be careful though. Like on the one hand, you can use transports after that point for cover. We've talked about this extensively. We had that as part of our transport series that we did here on the channel. Just keep in mind that if you throw away your transport, even to become heavy cover to protect your men, if there is a tie on objectives, you coughed up a victory point potentially. Okay. So just things to remember and things to keep in mind, because that is worth noting, and it could be the difference between winning the game or losing. Light armor cannot score for you, but they are a good way of making sure enemy infantry won't be scoring. So I still think it's probably worth it to take your DV7, DV8 sort of vehicles. And again, it helps to reinforce why DV7, DV8 vehicles are so heavy in the meta right now. But I think that is at least a reasonable thing to try to do, to provide, even if only long range fire support, if not aggressively moving up to push enemies away and getting the benefit of point blank range. Okay. Your artillery, machine gun teams, mortar teams are all really nice, because if you have objectives that are near the back line, more on that in a few slides, when we circle back to our deployment entering considerations, they can be really good for holding those down, as well as suppressing enemies that are on other objectives and potentially even clearing them. And so taking these kinds of support teams, there is still a place for them. And not commonly seen as a high-performing unit in a lot of these scenarios, you also have the small infantry squad. And the big benefit behind this is that they can not only be a source of providing an awful lot of pins to kind of lock down and hold down enemies who are holding an objective, but they can also overwhelm an objective with objective holders, right? Where if the small and hopefully dwindling number of enemy non-vehicles near an objective starts to disappear, and you've got 3, 4, 5 units over there, even if they're all relatively easy to remove, if there is the end of a turn where you still have at least one of them and the enemy has no infantry, you have it, right? So that's just a thought, okay? So, just things to think about. The small infantry squad, it doesn't always work, but it could work here if you use it correctly. Now, units who are likely to struggle, the medium and heavy armor, for pretty obvious reasons. Not only are they taking up a large number of your points, and thus probably affecting your order die count, they can't score. In this particular case, they are not great at holding objectives other than providing cover saves for the other guys that are behind them. So as much as I love medium and heavy armor for a lot of nations, they're not necessarily the best play here. That doesn't mean don't take it. It just means realize that they're going to have to be contributing to making sure that you're winnowing down the enemy, because if they are not contributing to that, then they could very easily be setting you back. Similarly, single machine gun vehicles, whether that's just a single machine gun in a turret on an armored car, or whether it's a light machine gun in its place, or even just like a tank with a light AT gun and a medium machine gun as its coaxial armament and no additional other weapons. It's just got the one machine gun. Not actually all that good, because it's not going to remove very many infantry when you factor in how many of those shots are actually going to hit potential for wounding and then cover saving after that. There's a very good chance that these 1 MMG vehicles are not going to perform very well. Now, does that mean you should leave them all at home? No, I'm one of the guys who's been running Polish 7 TP tanks in 3rd edition, even though everybody says to just go full in on the TKS Tankets. I think there's still a reason to take them. It has more to do with dueling enemy armor and protecting and preserving your forces than it does anything else. Okay, but at least has a machine gun. It can assist with potentially helping to winnow down infantry. Sure, it's maybe not as good as other tools, but you need a multitude of options for dealing with different threats. And so I tend to find that it's still worth taking them. You just have to work it into your overall strategy, and it might require a little more effort in this particular scenario. Similarly, inexperienced squads, they are not great for starting on the table. And remember, only half of your force gets to do that, which means there's a very decent chance that it's going to have to be brought in from reserve, and there's a very good chance that could go very badly. Because even if you're ignoring the -1 penalty for coming in, you still have the issue of you're rolling for an 8 or lower, right? So, and you can put these in a truck if you really want to, or some other sort of transport. I think you might be wasting points by buying an entire transport and devoting it to an inexperienced squad, but up to you as to what you want to do. They do allow you to field other stuff in larger numbers. Generally speaking, that tends to be armor. In this particular scenario, that actually doesn't help as much as it would in other scenarios. So from a deployment and terrain considerations, what would I do? First and foremost, when thinking about cover, we're going to need to think about central cover, because if you can control all of the objectives that are on the center line or on your half, you'll win the game. So central cover, especially around that central objective, is going to be important. Similarly, deployment zone cover is going to be important, because you can deploy one of the objectives within 3 inches of units that would start in your deployment zone. So I would seriously consider putting one of them, but not both. More on that in a little bit. I would put one of them near your own deployment zone, so that from the beginning of the game, you activate a unit, they end their turn, they're within 3 inches, you claim the objective. Nice and simple. The reason why I wouldn't put the second one on there comes in from the fact that you have to think about reserves, okay? What I would do is I would deploy the one that is near your deployment zone in as much as you can toward the center of the board, while still, of course, maintaining that at least 18 inches away from the central objective. Okay? And the reason for doing that is we want to deter the opponent from picking that side as their outflanking side. And then we want to place the other objective, not necessarily like just beyond 6 inches. In fact, I would recommend something closer to like 12 to 13 inches away from the edge, because again, we do get some freedom on this, but we want to make it so that it's relatively close to the edge. That's the target for enemy infiltration. And we want to place it a decent bit up. Choose a place that's still defensible within the context of cover, where your units on your half of the board would have cover, but people who are on approach, they would be pretty open. And keep in mind the potential for outflankers. And the reason why we want to do that is on the first turn, we want to be able to move troops up, take that objective, make sure that it's ours, and be kind of baiting the enemy into coming there. So this is going to be a defensive force. It's going to be a protective force. We're going to have units maybe in our deployment zone that have the fixed property that are going to be set up, deployed on ambush, waiting to hit units that are coming for that objective. And then we're going to have other aggressive troops that are right on it to make sure they maintain it and hold it. And what this does for us is it does two things. Number one, we can send a token force that's durable. Call it about a third of our army between reserves coming in on second turn and the units that start there to that far left objective in this case, as an example. And that group is just designed to just deal with whatever the enemy throws to us. They are not planning on pushing up toward the other objective in the quarter that's just above them. The second thing that you want to then do is you want to put the bulk of your forces. I would put close to 2/3 of them and make sure that they are coming in very close to that closest objective that you have on the right-hand side. And the reason why is two things. Number one, it's going to help to make sure that you maintain that objective. You need at least one. The second thing is from there, you can spread out and go after the central objective and potentially push up toward the other quarter. And this is a strategic advantage that you get if they don't put their outflankers on that right-hand side, on their army's left, on your army's right. If you can punch through and start taking that objective, they might have spread their forces out so thin that they didn't plan around having to reinforce that. And they're not going to have the resources on hand to be able to throw that way. You could suddenly find that the 3 that you're holding are the 2 that are on your side and the far one. Or possibly the even best scenario is you get the opportunity, if you want to fall back from your left-hand objective. Their outflankers come in from that side. And you find that you're holding in the center and the right-hand objectives, your right-hand, their left-hand objectives. And suddenly they don't have literally enough turns to get to all of them with the troops that they have. And that would be like the chef's kiss, okay? So my recommendation would be go up, token force, hold on. If you want to outflank coming in from reserves, you can definitely do that, okay? Because again, the objectives do have to be beyond 18 inches from the center point, so they are going to be in the closer half of each quarter to one side. You might consider just pulling in your outflankers and saying, well, we're going to go on that same side where we're planning on going on offense and using it for a multiple side push and just, again, relying on about a third of your forces just holding that other side as long as they possibly can, okay, to buy you time for the rest of it, okay? So in thinking about roads, we're planning our road access for our half-tracked and wheeled vehicles. Again, we don't want to bottleneck our vehicles. We talk about this every time, okay? But especially pick one half, okay, and push on that side. The other side you can just hold on. You don't need to be putting transports and other stuff like that over on the opposite side. Obviously, if you have really great lanes and lines and stuff like that, like you could potentially throw, a big squad in a transport or something like that up onto that 5th objective that's currently not being pushed in the picture if you really just want to kind of tie down people and make things a little bit of a mess. But I think in general, you're just throwing away points. And again, if you end up in a weird scenario where there are ties, we don't want to have thrown away troops needlessly early on in the fight, okay? But most importantly, make sure that you're building your plan for where your transports are going to come in and where they're going to roll out. Stack them because you want to make sure that you can get concentration of forces where you need them in an efficient manner, okay? So our primary approach here is going to be rush and crush. We're going to push up on objectives very quickly. We're going to remove infantry on those objectives. It's not to say don't worry about the vehicles, but it is to say that the vehicles don't contest, so we don't need to factor those for the purpose of flipping them, okay? You can take your time in bringing up your anti-tank. You can take your time in activating other units that are designed to remove them or pin them or things like that. The biggest thing we need to do is remove enemy infantry, flip objectives if they are already held by the enemy, and hold. That is the most important stuff, okay? And once again, we mentioned this in the last video, but it does hold true here as well. Going down, especially if you're on that objective that you're planning on just holding on to, you're not actually planning on pushing from it or aggressively moving against the enemy there. Don't be afraid to just issue the down order, okay? Obviously, if they're shooting at you at point blank range, don't do that, okay? But, if they're not, don't be afraid to just use the down order. Sure, you may not be pinning the enemy over there. You may not be removing as many men over there, but you will be maintaining your forces over there. And all we need to do is buy time. That is all we need to do with that objective, okay? So what changes would you make? Well, if you can't figure it out, the change I would actually make is I would say that on this particular scenario, there is no outflanking. Now, for thematic reasons, as we'll discuss in about 2 minutes, it is very possible that outflanking is part of the point, that it is thematic to it. So I might walk this back depending on what the theory is behind the nuts scenario and why it's called nuts. Okay. But here's my thinking. What it could cause is because of the fact that all of the, 4 of the 5 objectives have to start within roughly 18 inches of a short board edge, outflanking makes it very, very easy on turn 3 to get very lopsided very quickly. Okay. It could make it just too easy to just quickly swing the game, which could end up making it very little fun, especially in a scenario where both players have chosen the same side as the side where they're going to outflank their forces from. And you end up with a draw where, because of how things work, your opponent gets like 4 draws in a row and he just moves them on and starts obliterating everything. And by the time your forces come on, there's really nothing they can really do, nothing effective that they can do. Or, heaven forbid that they should be finish units who can move onto the board as an advance order and then go on ambush. And they just wait for all of your outflanking troops to come on, right? There's just a lot of ways that it could get really messy while also still throwing off the balance in terms of objectives. So personally, I would just remove the outflanking. It's still interesting. It's still a lot of things to consider. It's still a lot of craziness, which I think is the point. But more on that in a little bit. Okay. One thing I will note, and I believe this is part of the theme, I think this is what they're intending to do, is I actually don't mind that the scoring can switch. I think it's actually very helpful. One, because it does generally avoid draws. The chance that you're tied on objectives already is relatively low, but if it does come up, the chance that you're tied on total units removed is even lower. So as somebody who, when running an event, would prefer not to have to score draws and would prefer to have straight wins and losses, it is really nice that this scenario is a little bit harder to get a draw in, which is nice. And I don't know, as a player who has played competitively and who has gotten effectively to table 1 in events before, I would personally prefer to have a scenario that I don't look at and immediately think this is very possibly going to be a draw, and thus I'm going to fall to a lower table. Probably. So, just things like that are just things that I tend to think about. The other thing, too, is that it does give a reason for people to keep fighting until the end, right? Because worst case scenario, you want to take even desperation shots, what we would call a Hail Mary pass here in the United States, which is an American football term, for just lobbing the ball way down the field and hoping that one of your guys catches it, okay? It kind of encourages that level of fighting. Because if you can just throw some shots at a very far objective, remove all of the units, and maybe that clears the objective and it goes neutral, then that could then reward you for just going for unit removal right there near the end, right? So I do appreciate that. It gives people things to do. There can sometimes in bolt action games come the point where it's like, what's the point? Why are we still playing? Other than gentlemanliness of taking your loss like a man. There's nothing wrong with that. But in general, I do like the fact that the switching of scoring makes it so that there's always a card to play, even if it's desperation play. Okay. And then finally, overall, it's really good. I really like this design. I think it's really interesting. I think it's cool. I think it helps to break up some of the normals while still making it relatively similar to things that we've had. It also helps to avoid some of the key position problems that you can get in key positions where somebody kind of stacks one side of the board because of how deployment works, where there's going to be at least 1 in each quarter. So you do have to spread out your forces. You can't just hurdle up on 3 objectives and be done. It makes it so that, it's not like the first player who rolled and gets to place objectives is placing 3 and the other person's placing 2. So it's effectively a stand back and shoot game for one player and not for the other because one of them is preset in the center. So, I think it's well designed. I am curious about the name and how it came about, because even with outflanking, it's not that nuts. It plays mostly, again, like key positions. It's not that crazy. The outflanking definitely does help to add to the craziness because outflankers are bound in this one to matter more because the objectives cannot be easily hidden near the center of the board. It also, it is nuts that the scoring can change as you go through it, which is cool, and definitely does add a bit of extra hairbraining to the equation. I'm not sure that it's, I don't know, maybe it doesn't feel quite as nuts. I feel like the shifting priorities scenario from the Commander's Compendium pack, where every time that you, or it might be Timely Scenarios, it's one of those two, where every time that you score it at the end of a turn, your opponent gets to move it 6 inches so they can move it closer to themselves, further away from you, that sort of thing. That feels more nuts, right, than this one does. So I almost wonder if there's something else that's missing from it. I don't want to overcomplicate it, though, because part of what makes for a good scenario is that it's relatively easy to understand, even if there's multiple ways to score, like the sector scenario, which is one of my favorites. Multiple ways to score. So on the whole, I think it's great. I haven't played this one before, but I've been talking with some guys in my group. I do look forward to playing it sometime soon. Might even record it here for the channel so you guys can see it. But what are your thoughts? Do you think that this is just another variation on key positions, no big deal? Is it just a dressed up version of that, or is there something really special going on here? Let us know down in the comments below, and I will see you next time.